I thought I would finally get some peace when my wife went out for the weekend, but I wasn't prepared for her nephew to arrive, or the house had been quiet for a month before the night I'm referring to ended the way it did. Ours, it was the type of quiet that only occurred after someone had taken their frenzied energy and gone for a few days. Considering all the commotion they caused, my wife Laura had taken a plane that morning to go see her sister in Seattle. I kissed her as she pulled her luggage down the stairs, saying, "Short weekend trip." All smiles and scent. She waved goodbye at the door, got into the waiting taxi, and stood in the corridor for a while. I could have anticipated to feel at ease once it drew away the stillness that was encroaching on me like a tide. I felt relieved, but what surprised me was the loneliness. Not the loneliness that comes from being by yourself. It was a more profound thing that had been developing within me for months or maybe years, and now that she was gone, and that the house was now calm and had room to extend its limbs. I went around the rooms aimlessly, arranging everything. Things didn't require cleaning or straightening, wiping counters that were already spotless in an effort to avoid admitting just I was drying a glass at the kitchen sink when I noticed how empty the space felt, without her voice. Really used, and the sound of the doorbell ringing shocked me. I scowled and put down the towel in the silence, pushed aside, and walked across the floor to the front door. When I opened it, my wife's nephew, Evan, was standing there with one. His shoulders relaxed as his fingers caught on his backpack strap, but there was a brief moment of hesitation in his gaze that surprised me by saying, "Hey," with a tiny smile. "I hope it's okay." I went to see Aunt Laura, and she said I was taken aback when she didn't indicate that she might crash here this weekend while she's away, but of course Evan went past me and the air, and I forced a smile. "Oh, sure, come in." Seemed to change as he walked in, as if something livelier and warmer had come with him. He put his luggage by the bottom of the steps and turned back to face me while stroking his slightly disheveled hair, saying, "I can remain in the—" He added, "I just didn't want to stay with my mum this weekend because she's having one of her. The guest room or the couch is fine too." I nodded, trying not to look at how his shirt clung to his chest or the little sheen. Everything is a mess, phases of perspiration down his clavicle. "Guest room's made up. You're welcome to it," he said, with his seductive smile once more. That made it difficult to turn away. "Thank you. I previously inquired whether you were hungry." I needed a diversion from the way my thoughts had started to wander, so I turned back towards the kitchen. "I was just about to shore," he responded, following me. "If you're cooking, I'm eating." We ended up in the kitchen. Make something simple. I sliced veggies as we settled into a comfortable rhythm, and he leaned against the counter to tell me about his, after too many missed texts, he finally broke up with his on-again, off-again boyfriend while working his part-time job. With unfulfilled promises, I listened, occasionally asking questions, and I'm thankful for the talk, even though I couldn't help but notice how close he was. He had matured significantly since the youngster who used to cower behind his mother's legs during family get-togethers was gone when I last saw him, and in his place was a dinner was casual stir-fry, and the man moved with quiet confidence and gazed at me without flinching. He told me jokes over rice at the little table by the window that made me laugh more than I should have, and I observed him observing me during the breaks between chats, as though he was anticipating something I hadn't provided. However, after cleaning the kitchen and clearing the plates, We found ourselves in the living room, where the television was humming. He was lounging on the couch with his legs out in front of him while we watched a movie in the background. He said so as I sat at the other end with a bottle of beer sweating in my palm. He eventually cocked his head in my direction and asked, "What do you do when she's gone?" "You must be nice because you have the place to yourself." "Of nice, isn't it?" I hesitated, carefully swirling the bottle, then said, "I suppose it's quiet." "You ever get tired of being alone in your own house?" he asked me, his eyes darting in an unreadable way. I was taken aback by the question and by how strongly it struck. "Yeah," I replied after a moment, "more than I expected to." He gave a long nod, then grabbed the remote control and turned off the TV, bringing the room to a more subdued silence. "You don't have to be tonight," he replied plainly. I didn't respond immediately because my heart was beating too quickly. There was a weight in the air, but also because there was a silence that buzzed with possibility. I should have said or avoided saying something as a nephew, not as a guest, but as something else entirely. I got up, made a clumsy joke, and went to bed. But instead, I sat there and let the silence descend. He remained near. Evan and I remained motionless, and the TV screen lit, faintly moving light on the walls across the room, but we weren't paying any attention to it at the time. He leaned slightly on the couch, his arm hanging over his back, while his legs curled up behind him to face me directly, fingers playing absently with the fabric between us, getting close enough till he said softly, "You look tired," without touching, and I quietly laughed. He shrugged, giving me a knowing smile, but only if I shake my head so clearly. "You know what you should look for." There was something odd and disarming about the way he spoke without hesitation. Away from giving me a serious look, his eyes were free of judgment and simply hung on as if he could see through the courteous smiles and small conversation I'd employed for years to keep folks at bay. With a silent groan, I leaned back into the couch and rested a bottle of beer on the coffee table. The room felt warmer now, yet I briefly closed my eyes as I let my head drop, not sure if it was the heat or simply the knowledge of him next to me. Lean on the sofa and ask, "You always keep this much inside?" His voice was lowered and now more personal. As I turned to face him once again and asked, "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but it wasn't a casual one. "You just seem like someone who is rarely asked how he is doing, as if no one truly understands what is going on in his life." He was right, of course, and most people didn't ask, and when they did, it wasn't really a question I knew how to respond to. It was merely something you were expected to say, and I think I didn't anticipate an honest response. Become accustomed to talking little, yet eventually it's simpler that way, but not. There was a gap before he said, "Better. Not for you." It was one of those times when it's just long enough to indicate anything, and I could sense the air changing once more, as if something had happened between his hand, then went slowly and quietly closer to us without one of us naming it. His fingers hovered slightly over my thigh where it rested, brushing my knuckles without quite touching them. I glanced down at his hand, and then back at his face, but he didn't. I murmured, "What are you doing?" in a softer voice than I intended. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Unless you." His desire for me to be honest surprised me. There was no pretense, no sneer, and no attempt to hide it. Just calm vulnerability in a joke. And he was now observing me as if he had handed anything over something delicate, and I should have pushed back instead of waiting to see if I would crush it or hold it. reminded him of who we were and the boundaries we were not allowed to breach. But those boundaries seemed more hazy. My wife and I are hundreds of miles away from him, and the house is quieter than ever, saying things to me that I hadn't heard in years while sitting this close. You shouldn't. I whispered to myself more than to him. I might not be doing this. But he nodded softly and didn't back off. Wish to. At last, his fingers lightly touched mine, pressing slowly and tentatively. And I didn't move. I know you're married, he added, not asking for anything, but simply being there. His voice was almost audible above a whisper. I understand how this appears, but I can also see how isolated you are and how long you've been merely going through the motions. And I don't believe you deserve that. A stinging pain in my throat caught me off guard. Yet, it wasn't just the words. It was the genuineness with which he delivered them. I confessed that I had no idea what I was doing, but I cared with an unwavering passion that left no room for concealment. That's all right, he continued. You don't need to know. His thumb moved slowly and deliberately across the side of my hand, as he was, in an attempt to calm something more profound than our skin. The silence encircled us once more, this time softly and completely. Doesn't feel empty, but rather tense and anticipatory. As he leaned closer, without abruptly, it was not hurried. Rather, it was the kind of movement that allowed me ample opportunity to halt it, but I chose not to. Sat there, inhaling and observing, as his lips moved and his face slanted closer, opened just a little, and when they touched me at last, I couldn't breathe. So gentle. It was more like a brush, rather than a declaration or a test to check if everything would collapse due to this one tiny interaction, but it didn't. Instead, I leaned. Our mouths briefly touched again, more slowly this time, and more fully. When I felt him moan into the kiss, we withdrew. When I turned my hand under his and gripped his fingers in return. After a while, neither of us moved, and the air between our mouths was warm with breath. I shouldn't be, I whispered again, but this time the words lacked conviction. I know, he whispered, but we are, and I didn't stop it. I'm not sure how long we sat so close that we could feel one another's breaths, but we were too scared to get up and disrupt whatever delicately charged equilibrium had been established between us. The house remained shrouded in a silence that wasn't. Something new was generated in the space between our mouths, something suspended, and it was born out of nothing. His lips remained on mine like the warmth of the sun after nightfall. Even when we began to drift apart a little, I could still feel the kiss's gentle, inquisitive shape. But what really got to me was not the touch, but rather the way he stared at me revealed the underlying reality that was behind it. Evan just sat there staring at me as if I was someone worth kissing. He wasn't demanding, he was focused on mine, and continued to hold my hand as if to ground us both. He wasn't hurrying, he was just being totally present, which is something that very few people ever do. And I felt seen outside of a surface for the first time in a very long time. As myself, not as a husband, host, or man who cleaned the dishes after everyone else had gone to bed. The man behind the part, the one who had silently folded laundry in the shadow of someone else's room for too many nights, pandemonium, as I gazed down at our hands once more, waiting for a nice word that never came. My thumb moved, but his fingers were longer than mine, his nails were tidy, and the back of his hand was youthful and smooth. His eyes were already waiting when I gazed back up, brushing the smooth flesh beneath his knuckles without thinking. I keep trying to persuade myself out of this, but they have no expectations, only patience. He offered the smallest hint when I whispered in a voice that was scarcely louder than breath between us. "Me too," he murmured, with a gentle smile curling at the corners of his lips. I didn't respond aloud, but I believe we've already gone over that stage. However, the stillness between us was a response in and of itself, containing all I was unsure of how to express. I turned slightly more fully towards him, and when I did, my leg touched his. Wasn't a coincidence. None of us turned away. Evan let out a slow breath and looked. His chest rose and sank a bit more quickly as he flicked down to my mouth and then back to my gaze. He leaned in again, more slowly, as the flush started to rise along his throat. Observing me this time for any indication of hesitation, I didn't pause. I didn't want to kiss him again, because the second kiss was deeper, and his mouth moved against mine with quiet assurance, as if he had been waiting for approval for a long time, and now that he had it, I didn't want to spend any more time, so I answered without hesitation, opening my mouth slightly to let him in. My hand went from his to his shoulder and then up into his hair fingers, revealing a side of myself I hadn't seen in years. As he moved closer, he threaded between the silky strands, drawing our bodies together with something more ancient than caution, with one leg straddling each side of me as he balanced his weight. He climbed carefully into my lap without breaking the kiss. Warm and firm on my thighs, I took a deep breath upon making complete contact. He put his arms around my neck, his breath coming as his body pressed against mine, giving me a jolt in the chest. Faster now, his lips tracing mine as if he were trying to commit them to memory, while our bodies moved cautiously and slowly as if we were using touch to learn a new language. So I put my hands on his back and waist and pulled him in a little tighter. I needed to feel more of him, since he was warm all over and his skin was glowing. I could feel his heart thumping steadily and quickly where our chests connected through the thin material of his shirt, mimicking my own. As he gathered his breath, he briefly withdrew, his mouth slightly open and his eyes half lit. "You feel, wow," he whispered in a husky, incredulous voice. I had no idea. Load, keeping my hands on his hips. I haven't felt anything like this in a long time. His forehead wrinkled slightly at that, and he leaned forward, kissing the corner of my mouth, then my jaw, and finally the side of my neck with each kiss. Tongue temporarily strayed to sample my skin. I could feel him grinning against my throat as my hands tightened around his waist, drawing him in without intending to. Said in a whisper, "Then let me remind you." I was speechless at what followed and could only hear the gentle rustle of his shirt, exposing smooth, pale flesh stretched across strong muscle. D didn't hurry me, allowing me to move as I needed to. I glanced up at him once again, uncertain if my face revealed my anxiety, guilt, my intense need, but he simply leaned down without recoiling, if it did, and gave me another, deeper kiss, this time with a passion I didn't realize I was missing until it appeared out of nowhere, encircling me like a wave as our bodies started to move in unison, slowly and hesitantly. But I persisted. Thinking, I stopped asking questions. Let it happen. Let him lead in some situations. Let me lead in others, and even if the act itself carried serious repercussions and was frowned upon, it was he gently and patiently stroked me, opening me up as if I was something. He desired not only to own but also to comprehend that it wasn't hectic or hurried as we went through the night, like two individuals rediscovering what it meant to be selected for visibility. And I knew long before it was ended that I would always remember it because the room seemed different now, and it wasn't only, but it was the silence and the weight of the heat we had generated between us that hung in the air like a pulse. The feeling that we had entered a place outside of time, where nothing outside the bedroom's four walls felt genuine. All I could think about was the clock on the bedside table, not the dim knowledge that the world was still spinning outside the curtains. Feel as though he was hovering over me, his clothing long since thrown away. His breath caught as his body hung down to his waist, shining dimly in the gentle light coming in through the window. Slowly, I moved my hand down his side, stopping at the faint dip in his waist before moving back up along the... He stretched his torso and gazed down at me with eyes that were tender and possibly even lustful. Something more profound that I couldn't yet identify with confidence, but it still imprisoned me. His hands moved, so he leaned down to plant a leisurely kiss between my collarbones as my chest expanded flat against my skin. Intentional, and as his lips slightly parted, I tasted the hollow just above with the moist warmth of his tongue. I wasn't accustomed to this softness, and my eyes fluttered shut in my sternum. Every place his fingers went, I reached up and cupped the back of his neck because it felt like a question running along my skin that he was letting me answer at my own pace. His back muscles were flexing, and his skin was warm and silky as we pulled him down to realign our bodies. As he moved over me beneath my hands, the contact between our hips caused him to make a trembling gasp against my lips. It made me cling to him more tightly as he spoke my name in a hidden voice. Only once, but the way he said it caused a knot to form in my chest. I hadn't heard someone speak to me like that in years. Even my wife, perhaps more than she, moved with me as we gradually found a rhythm. There was no performance in his movements, no pressure, simply discovery. It was more about intimacy than haste, his fingers running down my tummy and his tongue pressing behind my ear, silent exhale. And then I completely stopped thinking when my hands moved down to his thighs and held him steady. Forgot who I was supposed to be and just heard our breath and the gentle touch of flesh on skin. He led me gently to my side and then back to our positions, allowing me to simply be and exist in the moment with him. When we eventually joined, we were only slightly apart, yet always close. His fingers threaded securely through his forehead, which was pressed to mine in a deliberate, almost reverent manner. Mine next to my head, and the breath seized in both of our throats simultaneously. He didn't immediately move, though, simply remained that way inside me, encircling me in a manner I had never encountered before. I opened my eyes and discovered that he was already observing me with a feeling of longing for something quite excruciatingly pure. And then we started to move in tandem with each shift of his, not in a panic or with desperation, but with something more akin to devotion. Hips felt like a pledge, and every kiss on my throat felt like a silent confession. He knew that when he felt. When I brought him closer and adjusted with a level of awareness that made my entire body twitch, my breath came more quickly. He kissed me through the pain, the strain, the ascent, the shattering. And when I got to the brink, it was peaceful, private, and my body arched beneath it. It wasn't aggressive or desperate. I held his hand tightly as I released it, and at that moment, I didn't feel guilty or ashamed. I just felt. He quickly followed, after burying his face in my neck, and I put my arms around him as his body trembled over mine. I felt his whole body pressing into mine as his gentle groan shattered across my skin while he held him through the storm. He seemed to want to vanish entirely inside of me, and after we stopped talking for a while, he passed out. One arm was softly placed across my stomach next to me, and his fingers were making lazy, aimless patterns across my side while we breathed. Gradually returned to normal, the silence now containing a strange aching that wasn't tension or remorse. Beneath the covers, his naked legs entwined with mine, his head resting in the crook of my shoulder, and I was unable to move because his weight seemed natural to me. His thumb made little circles on my ribs, and when I don't want to act like this didn't happen, but when he finally spoke, his voice was low and full of something I couldn't yet identify. I turned my head a little and pressed my lips to his wet hair, but I don't. He whispered softly, "You're not like her. You actually feel things." I let out a deep breath, which could be the reason I'm in trouble. His head raised a little, and he gave me a lopsided smile. I couldn't help but smile back, and he leaned into the touch as my thumb brushed his jaw. This is trouble, but I don't mind. He briefly closed his eyes, as if it were unusual. Perhaps for him, it was because we laid there for a long time without either of the chamber had cooled a little, but we remained at the surface, just living and talking little. Covers the skin against the flesh, and I could feel the faint heartbeat. As he completely relaxed into me, I watched as the tremor in his body subsided and his breathing evened out, and his hold on my side grew softer. When he fell asleep, the wrinkles in his face smoothed out the furrow that appeared to be there all the time. Even when his smile finally faded, he appeared younger and more content, and I remained awake for a long time after his breathing stopped, became steady and deep as I gazed at the ceiling and heard the kitchen refrigerator hum in the distance. Occasionally, when he dreamt, I knew what we were doing because of the house's settling creak and the quiet sighs that occasionally escaped him. Had done, and even though I understood what it meant, I didn't regret it in the least. Had settled into a peaceful silence, but it wasn't the same as what had persisted earlier that night when the house felt too empty to endure. The quiet was somehow deeper and warmer, with entangled strands of shared air. The faint echo of words that had never needed to be spoken out loud, and the smell of skin on the limbs as Evan slept. His head was still resting on my shoulder next to me, and he had one arm slung low around my waist in the sort of half-huddle that felt honest and unaware. Having not moved for what seemed like an hour, I'm terrified that if I do anything at all, the magic of this evening will end and reality will return. With his breathing was calm and gentle despite all the questions and implications. I laid there in the gentle rhythm of my exhale, stroking the side of my chest, which calmed me more than I wanted to admit. Darkness. My eyes wide open, and I traced the faint shapes of the ceiling fan in the corner, staring at the shadows above us. A familiar aching crept into my body when the walls ended, and the vast expanse of nothing looked back at me. Not physically, but emotionally, it was the peculiar burden that follows intimacy after a need has been satisfied. When desire has transformed into contentment, it's the time when everything slows down and when you stop responding and begin to think, ask yourself what it all means. God, I was thinking too much, and I could still feel the heat of his hands on my sides, his mouth against my collarbone, and the impression he left on me. whispered my name as if it were his own, and he had touched me with such tenderness that I was unaware I was starving. Hit something buried deep inside the layers I'd accumulated over years of constraint and separation. I had long since given up on anyone trying to find him, and now that I'm lying beside him in the dim moonlight, I was characterized by a subdued fear that my wife, whom I couldn't identify, would return home in less than 48 hours. The idea made me uneasy, not because I was afraid of her, but more because I wasn't sure I could resume acting as though our conversation tonight hadn't been impulsive or informal, because it wasn't the outcome of excessive alcohol consumption or the carelessness of temptation. It had been gradual and personal. Nevertheless, he had given me the impression that I was important, that I was desired, rather than merely needed, and that there was a difference. Evan roused a little as I felt it in every kiss and gasp on my skin. His hand tightened next to me, resting on my stomach for a second before moving closer to his. He muttered something unintelligible, then calmed down, his body twisting as his breath tickled the base of my throat. Without thinking, I let my arms fall naturally around him and drew him in as my fingers touched his warm skin, along his back, and when he responded with a soft murmur that suggested he was partially sleeping, I knew I didn't want to be. I'm not sure when I fell asleep, but I don't know where else. Not tonight. Maybe never. I awoke to the faint sound of birds outside and the pale grey of morning peeking through the drapes. Window, the illumination softened the room's boundaries, reminding me that even though Evan had moved during the night and was now on his back, time hadn't stopped after all. With one arm freely draped across his chest, the other extended towards me, his hand brushing my ribs under the covers, his lips slightly parted in slumber, his face relaxed, and he appeared. So I studied him for a while, not knowing what I was waiting for, and he seemed so young that it made my chest constrict, because perhaps I hoped he would awaken, smile, and say something that would clarify things, or perhaps I was afraid he would wake up and remain silent. So I finally got out of bed as quietly as possible, putting on a pair of sweating and making my way silently down the hallway to the kitchen. The house was still holding. I filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, and rested against the counter as it started to heat up in the chilly early morning. I didn't hear him enter, and my head was still clouded by everything that had transpired and nothing that had been uttered. I turned to see him standing there, only realizing he was there when I felt the warm touch of his hand against my back. Still without a shirt, his hair disheveled from slumber, and his eyes soft with something. "Didn't mean to wake you," I whispered softly, and he answered, "You didn't." His voice said, "I just didn't want to wake up alone." He then gave me a look that tightened my throat. With openness and silent vulnerability, he moved in closer, leaning in to rest his forehead against mine. I closed my eyes, breathed him in, and felt he said, "I know that, and I know that it wasn't a mistake," as his fingers slid back into mine like they had the night before. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak just yet, but I suppose you do too. I have no idea what he will say next, but I won't act as though it didn't have some significance for me alone. When my voice eventually came, it was quiet and shaky, yet it somehow managed to reach you. Does the kettle remain that way for a while in the gentle morning light? Starting to steam behind us, the silence became more than just a blank space. It was filled with something genuine and delicate. Eventually, we made coffee, We chatted in low tones about unimportant films while sitting at the kitchen table with the legs touching the floor. The previous evening had been filled with songs about locations we'd like to visit, yet each word felt like a thread connecting us, altered everything, and we both realized that there was no going back to what had been since he stayed through it. The morning and afternoon. But I didn't ask him to leave when the lights started to go out again in the evening, since I wasn't prepared to lose what we had discovered. Not just yet, perhaps never. The events that followed didn't go as planned, and I had prepared myself for feelings of regret and remorse. That I had crossed a border that I couldn't get back, but instead I felt numbness, silence, and stillness. I felt as though I could finally hear myself again, as if something inside of me had finally stopped struggling. Evan didn't. And after that night, neither he nor I woke up and pretended it hadn't happened. We didn't spend every he had to return to his own life after our brief separation, and I had to deal with my own realities, yet he occasionally returned in silence. Sometimes he remained the night, and other times he just came for coffee and sat with me on the back porch without saying anything. Once again, and when he did, it was quiet and cautious rather than hurried or concealed. My wife came home 2 days later, dragging her bag through what felt like a structure rather than a fire. The door as if nothing had changed, and perhaps she hadn't slipped back into her routines without realizing that I was paying more attention to her now and not filling in the silence. She didn't inquire about my whereabouts on Saturday night, or inquire about the additional mug in the folded blanket on the couch, the dishwasher, or perhaps she saw more than she admitted and just didn't want to label it. Despite the fact that nothing had exploded, the atmosphere between us had shifted over the course of several weeks. Evan and I had discovered something in the silence that was unimaginable yet unquestionable. And even though I wasn't sure what to call it, I recognized it was real. So I'd like to know what you think of our tale. Have you ever had a similar situation where something occurs? Have you ever met someone who saw you? It changes everything so subtly and profoundly without a single word. What would you have if someone touched you with their hands and their understanding when no one else did? Done in my place? Would you have intervened and left? Or would you have followed my example and allowed it to occur? I'm not sure whether it was appropriate, but I understand how it felt, and in a world where everything seems meaningless, there are moments when feeling something I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts, so please leave a remark below if you're just feeling something. Would genuinely be of more assistance to me than you can imagine. I appreciate you sticking by me through the finish, and if you'd like to hear more, there's always more to say about stories like this one, so hit subscribe.